Hi, everyone. I'm Stan Mallow. Welcome to Paranormal Yacker. My guest on today's show is Dr. Irena Scott. I'll be yakking with her about her book, Beyond Pascagoula, the rest of the amazing story. Dr. Irena Scott, welcome to Paranormal Yacker.
Well, I'm glad to be here and thank you for having me.
You received your PhD from the University of Missouri in physiology, did postdoctoral research at Cornell University, taught at a number of prestigious universities, worked for the Defense Intelligence Agency, served on the MUFON board of directors, and that just touches the surface of your achievement. What I would like to know, Irena, is at what point did an interest in UFOs enter the world of academia that was so much a part of your life?
Well, I'm not too sure if it entered academia. I was interested because my sister and I, when we were tiny children, had a UFO experience, and then we had another one when we were older, and I'd seen UFOs. I didn't go around talking about it in the academia atmosphere for a very long time, though.
In the annals of the history of UFOs and alien abductions, the October 11, 1973 Pascagoula abduction of Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker are quite notable. What occurred on that fateful October day that made it so memorable?
It was one of the top best known abductions. There were several reasons why. It's probably the best documented of any abduction. What happened is they were just two normal people. It was after their day of work and they decided to go fishing. And so they tried several places and didn't get any good fish. And so they went to this other place that the older man wanted to go to. The older man was Charles Hickson. He was about 45. And the younger was Calvin Parker, who was 19. They decided to go to this other place and it was marked no trespassing. The younger man was driving and it was his car. And so he was a little nervous about that. And the older man said, "Oh, don't worry about it. Nobody's going to do anything. I park here all the time." And so they went on in, walked to the pier and started fishing. They saw a blue light. They were worried about the police. The younger man said, that told the older man he could go to jail because it was his idea. And he didn't want to go to jail and have his car impounded or anything. But it was a whole lot worse than police because it was an object that appeared floating over the ground. It was about 2 feet off the ground, apparently. And just pretty quickly, it was kind of bluish. And then it was like it opened up and these things that might have been robots or beings or something came out and grabbed them both. Two of them grabbed the older man and one the younger man. They were, of course, absolutely terrified beyond belief. Suddenly it was like they were given a shot and they couldn't move and they weren't worried about it. It was like happens to people in hospitals where they give you a shot or an IV, but they weren't out of it. They were conscious. However, they couldn't move except for their eyes. And these things took them in to the object and gave a demonstration which looked like they were scanning the people. And something appeared to come out of the wall, a little thing, and circled them and things like that. They were being scanned. And they think it lasted about 15 minutes to 30 minutes. And then they were returned. During that time when they were inside, they couldn't move anything except their eyes. And they didn't see anything. They just saw light. There weren't furniture or anything. They were just these beings and light. And so when they were taken back out, the younger man seemed to be standing there with his arms up in the air, and the older man was trying to wake him up. Then they got each other awake, and I think they both collapsed, and the thing flew away. That was what happened.
Intensive research has uncovered many additional reports of UFO sightings in the area at around the same time. This number continues to grow, making it what many people believe, and as you just mentioned, is the best documented alien abduction account on record. Could you share some of those additional sightings?
Okay, I'd like to add, though, that the reason these people were believed was because after trying to report several places, they went to the sheriff's department. The sheriff interviewed them separately, put them together in a room with another interviewer. The interviewer left and they didn't know it, but there was a recorder hidden in there. And so the sheriffs were hoping to catch them laughing and saying they were hoaxing. And no, they were both absolutely terrified. And this lent a whole lot of believability, the instance besides everything else. And the other things were that the sheriff's department that night said they had recorded about 90 phone calls of UFO reports and quite a few other ones that nobody kept track of. So there were a whole lot of sightings that same night of mystery objects. And that's one thing that's made it the best documented of any, because there were so many other sightings and people are now coming forward and talking about it.
A great deal is not known about many elements associated with the Pascagoula event. It had numerous unique aspects, such as the instruments the alien beings appeared to scan the abductees with. Can you describe those devices?
This was a lot different from normal abduction accounts. For one thing, the beings or things or whatever they were, usually people picture aliens as sort of slender with big heads and big eyes and everything like that. Well, these were kind of the opposite. They were sort of porky looking little things with wrinkled skin. They had a head sort of like people, but where we have projections like ears and a nose, they had just something like carrots or something sticking out. Instead of legs, they seemed to float around on pedestals. So that was different to start with. And they thought they were mechanical instead of being beings. Then in the ship, they said that one of them thought he was placed on a glass table. And I think he said glass table because they couldn't see anything. They were just floating him around and twist him to a 45-degree angle. So he thought he was on a table. Then they had this thing that came around, circled. It was him like they were doing a scan. Well, that's like today's MRI or CAT scans, sort of. But today they put people on a gurney and shove them into a machine. And like with this, it was just like a little thing came out and went around. So it was a lot more advanced than what we have today. And also they seemed to be anesthetized. Back then, the way they did put people out was to put people to sleep. Well, now they have fentanyl and things like that, where they have a conscious thing where you don't feel any pain, but you're conscious. And that seemed to be more like what they use today, where they were conscious and they can move their eyes, but otherwise they were like paralyzed.
Abductions appear to happen as single events, but unlike what was first reported, there may have been several abduction attempts on the same night as the Pascagoula abduction. Could you elaborate on that?
There were several attempts. In one case, Calvin Parker had given a talk at the library at Pascagoula, and it was on YouTube. And somebody had written in and said that she knew it was true because her parents had watched it. So that was pretty interesting. Philip Manor found out who she was and asked me to interview the woman's parents. And so I called and talked to the father just very, very briefly. He said something about a big splash and about a blimp and handed the phone to his wife. They said he was a debunker and he didn't believe in UFOs and he thought they were all crazy and everything. And so his wife said that they had been on the opposite side of the Pascagoula from where the abduction took place that night by a pier. The husband was waiting for his supervisor to come because they were going out on a ship and do some work. And his supervisor was delayed and not there yet. And so they're waiting in the car. And she said she saw this object flying around. She thought it was an airplane flying along the Pascagoula River, just browsing. And she thought it was really, really weird because it was like the airplane didn't know where it was going. It was just flying around. Her husband decided to take his clothes to the ship. And so they walked down to the ship and he was ahead of her. And she said this thing came out of the water right beside her on the pier that looked like a man. And she seemed really emotional about that. And they went to the ship about 9. And she said she came back to the car about 12. And she was just absolutely terrified and ran to the car and left. She seemed really emotional about this thing that came out of the water. And I called her and talked to her and emailed her and everything else a number of times. And we emailed quite a bit. And she was very, very emotional about this thing that came out of the water. And I asked her if it was a fish. And she said no. And I said dolphin. And she said no. She thought it was a man, but she didn't understand why he didn't come out up to breathe again. After that, her husband became very ill and unfortunately died just before they intubated him or put him on a ventilator. He said that they had been abducted and that he could remember being on board. He could remember these creatures. He told her some detail about being on board, that they had been abducted. He said he saw these things later swimming back across the Pascagoula, then the object flying away. She recorded that and also called Philip Manor, and he talked to her husband. After that, her husband went on the ventilator and he couldn't talk anymore. So she was really curious. And so far, she's remembered the object. She's remembered the real bright light, which is what Calvin and Charles saw. But that's all she remembered. She doesn't remember being inside. And she thinks her memory's suppressed. Apparently, this happened the same night as the Pascagoula abduction, which would suggest that there were 2 abductions at about the same time, about the same place, and possibly by the same object. And that would be an absolute first for reported for any type of abduction.
Much happened at the same time as the Pascagoula abduction, such as reports of close UFO encounters, a thunderous boom, and similar episodes that swarmed overwhelmed operators in many states across the USA. The strange boom was no ordinary sound. How would you describe it?
One of two things that got me into this thing that made me write the book about Pascagoula. One was is that I had published with books with Philip Mantle, Flying Disc Press, and he wanted me to interview people in the United States that like the Pascagoula other witnesses because he was in England and had an English accent and everything. He wanted somebody here to talk to him, and I did and recorded him. But I was sort of involved with that for another reason. Way back when I was at the University of Missouri, my mother from Columbus, Ohio, had called me one night and said she had a strange sound and asked me if I had heard it. And I teased her a whole lot about it. She was 600 miles away, and I told her you couldn't hear it flipping and everything, just teasing and everything. And I didn't pay attention to it for years. But later I was working at Ohio State University where she was in that area and heard the sound. And she'd called me about several days later and said there was a huge UFO wave that people were keeping their kids in and staying in at night. They didn't want to drive. A UFO had chased one of her real good friends and things. It just sounded like a war zone. I was in the OSU library then years later, and they had a newspaper room with real life newspapers and things. And so I thought just on a whim, I would go and look that up and see if I could find out anything about the noise. There were zillions and zillions and zillions of newspapers. And I thought, I'll never do this. And I didn't even remember the date. And that's what I wanted to find was the date. I just roughly remembered where it was. I found it pretty soon after I started looking, to my great surprise, because I thought I'd never find it. It was the 11th of October, about the same time as the Pascagoula abduction, which I didn't pay attention to at all. I paid attention to the sound. It interested me because usually with UFOs, there's just one person and there's nothing scientific that you can investigate. In this case, there was a sound heard by many, many people. Got newspaper articles about how large the sound was. It was heard over quite a number of states, and there was nothing to attribute it to. And so I was going to write something like that in a scientific journal, and I submitted it, and the state seismologist of Ohio contacted me, and he helped me look for seismic stations and things like that and helped me. And then I did publish in a peer-reviewed scientific journal. That got me into UFOs because other people in Columbus, Ohio worked with UFOs, and they wanted me to give a talk about it. Well, I called it the Big Bang and gave a talk. And then I met these UFO people, and that got me into UFOs, something that happened the same time as the Pascagoula abduction. I was never very interested in the abduction until I started writing the book. I was interested in the sound. First, they always say that scientists are debunkers and all that. Well, the scientists I worked with were quite interested. I didn't say UFO or anything, but just in the sound, the physics of it and everything. Then I published years later in the MUFON Journal, which is a UFO journal. And that's where I got a debunker that debunked and debunked away. And he said it was a SR-71, this big plane, no longer flies, but it was just an amazing plane. Its path and everything were known. He said I was crazy and this was that plane. Well, I very weakly debunked my debunker in another article, saying that the sound wasn't where the airplane was, but I didn't have too much information. After that, NASA published a lot of information about sonic booms and about sonic booms of SR-71s, in general, how high the airplane has to be for the sonic boom is a certain size and things like that. A lot of my book was taken up by saying that this sound was really mysterious because nobody saw an airplane, nobody saw a meteor, nobody saw anything. It happened when there was a big UFO flap. It seemed to happen approximately the same time as the Pascagoula abduction.
The sound was analyzed according to NASA research on sounds, as you mentioned, and the findings were quite astounding. What were they?
What they were was that it was heard over maybe 12 states, starting in Iowa and going all the way to the coast over to Washington, D.C. and to the Atlantic coast. It was recorded in 2 seismographs, which is very strange for a sound from the air to get recorded on a seismograph. It was strong enough. So that was a huge area. It was about maybe approximately 1,000 miles across the country, very, very wide. And they have information now on sonic booms. And like if an airplane is at 5,000 feet, it may have a sonic boom of 50 miles. Well, the airplane he talked about was 80,000 feet, and that would mean it had a sonic boom on 40 miles on each side. The airplane's path was known, and the sonic boom was nowhere near the airplane path. That eliminated that to start with. But the sonic boom was way larger than any sonic boom known from an airplane, because it could have been like 400 to 700 miles wide, besides, going across the country. using the seismograph data, I could calculate the speed between the two seismographs, and that was about 2.9 times the speed of sound. The rest of it was just newspaper articles. This thing went across. There were newspaper articles in all the different states right across, which is very unusual to start with. I mean, people were running out of their houses. They were thinking their houses exploded. They were calling the fire departments. The fire departments actually made runs. They were looking with radar and everything else and not found anything. So it was very, very unusual. The other unusual thing was that the sound might have been 400 or 500 miles wide, which would mean the airplane was like in space where you wouldn't hear any sonic boom at all because there's no air molecules up there. But instead, it had such a strong overpressure. It shattered windows across 3 states. Doors would open from the pressure waves, and bells would ring, and all kinds of things besides people thinking their houses were exploding and thinking there was an explosion in the neighborhood. So it was really a spectacular thing. And it just didn't go along with the laws of science and physics at all for a sonic boom.
Unlike most UFO-associated phenomena where there is no hard scientific proof, as you had just mentioned, this sound was recorded on 2 seismographs, which may provide scientific proof of the existence of anomalous UFO phenomena-associated events. Do you believe that to be the case?
Well, after doing a whole lot of math and plotting it across the country, plotting where the SR-71 was and looking for other airplanes and things, yeah, I think it did, because there wasn't any evidence of an airplane doing that. And if it did, it wouldn't make that type of sound. I mean, this was totally different because it was widespread and concentrated with a big overpressure, and nobody saw a thing. So with 2 seismographs plus millions of people, I would say that's a pretty good evidence that something unusual happened. It was maybe the most widespread sound ever heard, except for the Krakatoa explosion. It went over a wide area.
You are a founding member of the Mid-Ohio Research Associates and its journal editor, and have published UFO material in books and journals, including scientific journals. In your opinion, Irina, what do you hope will be the next chapter taken by individuals and governments in the pursuit of contacting alien beings?
In the pursuit of studying, things are kind of opening up now. For example, the New York Times, which is a real serious, big, reputable newspaper, in 2017 talked about the UFO work, an article by Ralph Blumenthal. Also, it was on 60 Minutes in a very serious presentation. There's been a number of government people that have talked about it. For example, recently, the head of national intelligence said something ought to be set up to study UFOs and collect the information. The government is actually doing a little bit more than they ever did before. They had a report that came out in June or July, I forget, that actually said things can be flying around. They don't know what it is. And they've never admitted that since 1947. So things are kind of opening up just a little bit.
Should viewers of Paranormal Yacker want to buy your book, Beyond Pascagoula, The Rest of the Amazing Story, what is the contact information for doing that?
It's for sale on Amazon.com, and look for Beyond Pascagoula. And I have a lot of graphs and tables and everything else, especially about the sound. Also, I'll be giving a talk at the UFO Mega Conference in Las Vegas in March. So there's 2 things.
Irina Scott, I thank you for being my guest on Paranormal Yacker. I wish you success with your book and all your other undertakings. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. I'm Stan Mallow, the Paranormal Yacker. I hope you enjoyed the interview you just watched. To be sure you don't miss any interviews on my free YouTube channel, all you have to do is press the subscribe button on your screen.